second best outcome for global economies and markets, with both candidates being widely regarded as weak. That's the word from Citadel Chief Strategist Adrian Saville, who joins me now in studio to tell us more about the impacts and implications of the Trump presidency. Adrian, always a pleasure to meet you. Do you think we will? Do you really think we'd have got the short end of the stick with either candidate?
I think if you'd put them into many other sort of earlier versions of the same race, they would have come distant seconds. These were, by just about every measure you can bring, two weak candidates, and I would venture further that the weaker of the two actually triumphed.
So what do you know that Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, Joe Biden and everybody else don't know when they said she's more qualified than anybody ever to become president?
You know, I think that's you don't want to take credit away where it's due, but this is called electioneering, and you're not going to say our candidate is really good but not as good as other. Of course, this is the most capable, promising candidate anyone has ever seen. And by the same convention, the undertakings, the promises, the commitments that Trump made on the election circuit were exactly that. They were election circuit undertakings. So I think you always want to put a healthy dose of skepticism into the claims and the promises.
All right, okay, so let's not even bother with Hillary, because she's going to retire and she'll probably do more speeches for £1 million a pop, whatever it is.
I think her balance sheet is just fine.
She's okay. But we do now have President-elect Donald Trump. Let's start with the immediate reaction for us. The Rand was one thing that we noticed suddenly got much weaker as a result. What have been the consequences since we knew that Donald Trump was going to be president?
My suspicion is that in the fullness of time, Trump's policies, if they take the shape that he's suggesting, will actually play in favor of currencies like the Rand and other emerging currencies which have good financial institutions behind them. The immediate response, of course, to the Trump election was one of sort of a risk-on attitude or approach towards the US economy, because Trump has proposed two things. The one is a vigorous fiscal policy, and in our language what that really means is he promises to spend on infrastructure. And if that's well done, it could stimulate the economy near term. It could be very promising and encouraging for the US economy near term. The other thing that Trump, we know from his policy proposals, is very pro the private sector, and that suggests that he will take his hands off regulation. He's likely to keep interest rates and tax rates accommodatory, and so the monetary side of the economy will also help stimulate. So the Trump proposals are very promising for near term. To be a true economist, there are of course some howevers. And the however is there's no way that he has the ability to fund this. And that means that as things stand, more debt, larger budget deficits, and the likelihood also is of higher inflation in the United States.
All right, so this spending on infrastructure, didn't we try that here in South Africa, and where did we get with it?
Sure, so I think that this is why I've sort of carefully slipped in the caveat that if it's well done, and it's not to point a finger at South Africa. The experience with most public sector infrastructure delivery, regardless of which country it's done in, is public sector infrastructure tends to be delivered over budget, after time. In other words, it's expensive and it comes later than you had anticipated. The United States has a well-worn path in terms of doing this, as do many other developed countries. So I would anticipate that if this program takes form, it will be expensive. But even if it's expensive, if the infrastructure is effective, if it's good infrastructure that's delivered, that builds capacity, that promotes productivity, that could be really good for the United States. Think of the Reagan administration of the 1980s.
All right, so we're South Africa, we're busy watching all of this play out, and everybody says, when America sneezes, the whole world catches a cold. So what cold or flu or result might we have in the medium to long term? Because he's there for 4 years.
Yeah, so you say medium to long term.
Yeah.
Near term, there could actually be some tailwinds, and that comes in the form of improved commodity prices, because commodities are an important input into infrastructure. A little further out, if Trump is successful in his trade proposals, where on the foreign policy front, he has suggested a more protectionist stance. This could be specifically bad for South Africa in the form of, for instance, kicking the AGOA trade agreement to touch. That would be bad for South Africa. AGOA has been responsible for establishing, promoting tens of thousands of jobs in South Africa over the last 15 years.
All right, it's a good gig for us, but it's not as if it was bad for America. So he would have advisors around him. Barack Obama yesterday was saying, you know, when this guy gets in at the White House, this job has a way of, you know, giving you a wake-up call. So it's quite likely that maybe many of his promises and ambitions are going to have to be pulled back.
Absolutely.
And that's good for us.
I think that point is on the money, because there is this sort of there is this experience that we had last Wednesday morning, where almost in an instant Trump transformed from a demagogue to a statesman, and he delivered that 15-minute victory speech that was remarkable in its stature and in its perspective. In the transition that he goes through now, he has to appoint this transition committee which will reshape the West Wing of the White House, and that's, I think you're absolutely right. We have to pay particular attention to who he appoints, what the form and shape of that is. The immediate behavior, the immediate appointments, I have to say, are not very encouraging.
Right. So throughout this year, we were looking towards the end of the year about an interest rate decision, and this now perhaps has shaken things a little bit. What is the Fed looking at when it considers we've got a new leader, these are the things that he's been saying, what do we do?
One of the things that we've been very sort of constructive on and encouraged by in the United States is their normalization of monetary policy. The overwhelming suspicion being that in December the US will hike interest rates again. This is an important step on the path to normalizing interest rates, a decade after the global financial crisis. Janet Yellen, I think, will stay on that path when the Fed meets next month. That's the way capital markets have it priced right now. However, the bigger question is whether Janet Yellen survives.
Right.
And my suspicion is that Yellen will step down before her term ends in 2018.
And what would that mean then?
Well, what it means then is Trump then has a firm hand on both the domestic policy levers. He has a firm hand on the policy lever of government spending, and he also will be responsible for the appointment of the governor of the Fed, which means in turn he has a hand on monetary policy. This, by every measure, will be a Republican administration.
Okay, so we've talked about AGOA and its use for us. What about trade in general? Is that picture going to change, or is it going to be business as usual, certainly in the short term?
So what Trump has spoken about is the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA. There was also a Pacific and a transatlantic proposal that were on the table. The Atlantic and Pacific proposals are off the table. It's bad for Europe, it's bad for Asia, I think it's bad for world growth. Not that trade and the free movement of goods and services is unambiguously good, but overwhelmingly, where people and goods and capital are able to get across borders in relatively frictionless ways, that tends to be good for employment, good for income equality, good for economic growth. The Atlantic and Pacific arrangements are dead and buried. And North Atlantic, his suggestion is that he wants to renegotiate this. I'm not entirely sure what he wants to renegotiate, but it is within his discretion as well, when he becomes President of the United States, to kill that agreement. He has the right to veto the agreement.
Right.
And that would be, I think, a net negative prospect for world economic growth and for the United States.
So he wears two hats. On the one hand, his kids are going to be running his multi-billion-dollar empire.
Yeah.
He campaigned on this thing, we're going to clean things up, we're going to drain the swamp. But the reality is...
I love your American accent.
he's a businessman first. So
Yeah.
business, should it be worried? Because a lot of the vote was about pushing back against business
Sure.
and the establishment.
Should business be worried? In the very immediate term, business is likely to get relief in the form of more liberal government spending, easier interest rates, lower tax rates. That's also on the table. But if you think about the sanity, the sobriety of the Trump policies, I think in the fullness of time, they're going to work against sustained economic growth. They're going to work against inclusion. My suspicion is that 3-4 years out, we're talking about North America that is growing slower than we had expected, that is suffering under higher inflation, and whose income inequality has become more stretched. That's bad for business.
Okay. All right, we've run out of time, but very quickly, China is the other part of this equation. They've been very neutral about who they wanted to win, but Donald Trump has kind of not hidden his affections or disaffections towards China. If, I mean, heaven forbid, if there's trade wars or that goes on, what will be the consequences for the entire planet if number 1 and 2 in the world economy scales are at war?
And I think put in number 3, which is the Russians. And there's been a very clear sort of glancing at each other across the dance floor. And I think that also puts into play a fresh axis or element in the in foreign policy arrangements, that China gets pushed away and Russia gets pulled closer. I think we're in for fascinating times under the Trump presidency. All
right. Well, let's watch this space. Adrian, thank you very much indeed for your insights this evening. Let's see what happens.
Thank you.
All right.